somewhere beneath your feet. If you are standing in Mexico City right now, there are stones that remember a different world. Stones that were placed by hands that built the most magnificent city in the Western Hemisphere. Stones that witnessed the moment when one civilization ended and another began. The city that stood here 500 years ago was called Tenochtitlan. It was home to 250,000 people. It had floating gardens and towering pyramids and causeways stretching across a lake so beautiful that Spanish soldiers who saw it thought they were dreaming. And it was destroyed in less than 2 years. The Aztec Empire did not fall because its people were primitive. It did not fall because its warriors lacked courage. It fell because of a series of decisions that made perfect sense at the time, but turned out to be catastrophic. Decisions that anyone might have made, decisions that haunt the history of contact between civilizations. If you are using this to fall asleep, good. The Aztecs have been waiting 5 centuries for someone to understand what happened to them. They can wait a few more hours while you rest. The story will still be here when you wake. The questions will still be unanswered. Subscribe and stick around, because tonight we are going to trace the chain of events that turned the most powerful empire in the Americas into a Spanish colony. Not through alien intervention or supernatural forces, through human choices made under pressure, with incomplete information in a world that was changing faster than anyone could comprehend. In 1519, the Aztec Empire controlled most of central Mexico. They called themselves the Mexica, and their domain stretched from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico. 400 to 500 city-states paid tribute to them. 5 to 6 million people lived under their rule. The empire was built on conquest and tribute. Subject peoples sent food, cloth, gold, and captives to Tenochtitlan. The captives climbed the steps of the Great Pyramid called the Templo Mayor. At the top, priests cut out their hearts as offerings to the gods who demanded blood in exchange for keeping the sun moving across the sky. This was not sadism. This was theology. The Aztecs believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Humans owed a debt that could only be repaid in the most precious substance: blood, the hearts of warriors captured in battle. Without these offerings, the sun would stop, the crops would fail, the universe would end. The Aztecs even fought special wars called flower wars against enemies like the Tlaxcalans. These were not wars of conquest, but wars of capture. The goal was to take prisoners for sacrifice, not to destroy the enemy. This practice ensured a steady supply of sacrificial victims while maintaining ongoing rivalries. The Tlaxcalans had resisted Aztec domination for generations. They were surrounded by Aztec territory, cut off from salt and cotton and other necessities. But they would not submit. Their hatred for the Aztecs ran deeper than any suspicion of the strange newcomers from across the sea. But here is the thing about empires built on fear and tribute. The people paying that tribute do not love you. They obey because they have no choice. They wait for any opportunity to throw off the yoke. And when strangers arrive from across the sea with weapons that shoot thunder, some of those subject peoples see not invaders but potential allies. The man who ruled this empire was Moctezuma II, sometimes spelled Montezuma. He had been emperor since 1502. He was not weak or indecisive. He had expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He had defeated rebellions and conquered new territories. He was a skilled warrior and an experienced administrator. But Moctezuma had never faced anything like what arrived on his coast in the spring of 1519. 11 ships carrying about 500 Spanish soldiers, 100 sailors, and 14 small cannons. They were led by a 34-year-old nobleman from the harsh hills of central Spain. His name was Fernán Cortés. Cortés was not supposed to be conquering empires. He had been sent by the governor of Cuba on an expedition to explore and trade. The governor had actually tried to revoke his commission before he left, suspicious of his ambitions. Cortés sailed anyway, knowing that if he failed he would be arrested. If he succeeded, he would be rich beyond imagination. The Spanish landed near what is now Veracruz, and immediately encountered something that would change everything. Local leaders gave them gifts. Among those gifts were 20 enslaved women. One of those women would become the most consequential translator in history. Her name was Malintzin. The Spanish called her Dulce Marina. History remembers her as La Malinche. She spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and she quickly learned Spanish. Without her, Cortés could not have communicated with anyone. Without her, the conquest might never have happened. She had been born into a noble family, but sold into slavery as a child by her own mother. Her mother wanted her stepson to inherit without competition. She had been passed from owner to owner, learning languages along the way. By the time the Spanish arrived, she spoke multiple languages fluently. When local leaders gave 20 enslaved women to Cortés, they could not have known what they were giving away. They were disposing of property they considered expendable. But one of those women would become the most important person in the conquest after Cortés himself. La Malinche was not just a translator. She understood the political landscape in ways the Spanish could not. She knew which groups hated the Aztecs. She knew how to frame Cortés' intentions in terms that would appeal to potential allies. She was, in Cortés' own words, the person to whom they owed the conquest after God. At first she worked through another translator, a Spanish priest named Jerónimo de Aguilar, had been shipwrecked years earlier and learned Mayan. Malinche would translate from Nahuatl to Mayan, and Aguilar would translate from Mayan to Spanish. But she learned Spanish so quickly that Aguilar soon became unnecessary. Was she a traitor to her people? She had been sold into slavery as a child by her own mother. She had been passed from owner to owner until she was given to foreigners she had never seen before. The Aztec Empire was not her empire. It was the empire that had enslaved people like her. Perhaps she saw the Spanish as a way out. Perhaps she had no choice. We will never know what she actually thought. Cortés made a decision that has become legendary. He ordered his ships disabled, either sunk or run aground, and stripped of usable parts. His men could not retreat. They would conquer or die. This was either brilliant leadership or suicidal arrogance. Probably both. The Spanish had technological advantages that seem overwhelming in retrospect. Steel swords that could cut through wooden clubs and obsidian blades. Metal armor that could stop arrows and stones. Crossbows and early guns that could kill from a distance. Horses which the indigenous peoples had never seen, and which terrified them in early encounters. The horses were perhaps the most important advantage. A mounted warrior could move faster than any foot soldier, strike from above, and escape before enemies could respond. The Aztecs had never seen anything like them. Some accounts say they initially thought horse and rider were a single creature. Cannons and guns made noise that seemed supernatural. They killed at distances the Aztecs could not comprehend. They punched through walls and shields that had always provided protection. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage, but 500 Spaniards could not conquer an empire of millions through technology alone. Cortes needed allies, and he found them almost immediately: the Totonacs. A people who paid heavy tribute to the Aztecs approached him with an offer. They would help him if he would help them throw off Aztec rule. This pattern would repeat throughout the conquest. People who had suffered under Aztec domination saw the Spanish as liberators, not invaders. They did not realize they were trading one master for another. They only knew they hated the Aztecs and wanted revenge. Through La Malinche, Cortes learned that the Aztec Empire was not monolithic. It was a patchwork of resentful subjects held together by fear. Many groups would welcome any opportunity to strike back at their overlords. The Spanish did not need to defeat the Aztecs alone. They just needed to lead a coalition of everyone the Aztecs had wronged. The expedition began marching toward Tenochtitlan. Along the way, they encountered the Tlaxcalans, a powerful people who had resisted Aztec conquest for generations. At first, the Tlaxcalans fought the Spanish. After several battles that the Spanish barely survived, the Tlaxcalans made a different calculation. The Tlaxcalans had been fighting the Aztecs for decades. They had lost countless warriors to sacrifice on the Templo Mayor. Now strangers with terrifying weapons wanted to march against their ancient enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Tlaxcalans joined Cortes, providing thousands of warriors who knew the terrain and hated the Mexica. This is often overlooked when people tell the story of the conquest. The Spanish did not conquer Mexico with 500 men. They led an alliance of tens of thousands of indigenous warriors who had their own reasons for wanting to see Tenochtitlan fall. The conquest was as much a civil war as a foreign invasion. Meanwhile, Moctezuma was receiving reports about the strangers. They had defeated his tributaries. They had allied with his enemies. They were marching toward his capital with an army that grew larger every day. What should he do? Some advisors urged him to attack immediately, destroy the strangers before they got any stronger. But Moctezuma was cautious. He had never seen these people. He did not know their capabilities or their intentions. He sent gifts of gold and precious goods, perhaps hoping to satisfy their greed without fighting. Other advisors suggested diplomacy. Learn what these strangers wanted. Perhaps they could be bought off. Perhaps they would take their gold and leave. Perhaps they could even be useful allies against rebellious subjects. Moctezuma had many enemies within his own empire. Moctezuma sent spies to watch the strangers. He received reports about their weapons that made thunder, their giant deer that carried men on their backs, their dogs that could kill a man. He received reports about their appetite for gold, their strange religion, their seemingly invincible warriors. This was a fatal mistake. Moctezuma thought he was demonstrating his wealth and power, showing that he could buy off any threat. But the Spanish saw the gold and wanted more. Every gift convinced them that unimaginable riches awaited in the Aztec capital. The gifts that were meant to discourage became invitations. On the way to Tenochtitlan, the expedition stopped at Cholula, a city sacred to the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. Cholula was one of the largest cities in Mesoamerica, with a population of perhaps 100,000. Its Great Pyramid was the largest structure in the pre-Columbian Americas by volume. The Cholulans welcomed the Spanish with apparent hospitality. They provided lodging and food. They seemed friendly. But La Malinche learned that they were planning an ambush. Some historians question whether there was actually a plot. Others suggest Court Fays manufactured the excuse. Whatever the truth, the Spanish responded with overwhelming violence. What became known as the Cholula Massacre killed thousands of unarmed people. The Tlaxcalans, enemies of Cholula, joined enthusiastically. The blood ran through the streets of the sacred city. In 2 hours, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies killed thousands of Cholulans. The exact number is disputed. Some sources say 3,000. Others say 6,000 or more. The message was clear: resist the Spanish and face annihilation. Submit and survive. Many cities chose submission. And then, in early November 1519, the Spanish crested a mountain pass and saw Tenochtitlan for the first time. A city of 250,000 people spread across islands in a lake, pyramids rising above the water, causeways stretching to the shore, gardens floating on rafts, canals lined with canoes. The conquistador Bernal de Fez del Castillo, who was there, later wrote that some soldiers thought they were dreaming. The city was larger than anything in Spain. The markets were more extensive than those of Constantinople. The architecture was more sophisticated than most European capitals. These were not primitive people. This was a civilization. The city was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs had constructed artificial islands called chinampas by layering mud and vegetation in the shallow lake. These floating gardens produced food year-round, feeding a population that rivaled the largest cities in Europe. The great marketplace of Tlatelolco, the sister city joined to Tenochtitlan, hosted 60,000 people daily. You could buy anything there: precious feathers from tropical birds, cacao beans used as currency, obsidian blades sharper than steel, gold jewelry crafted by artisans whose skill, Court Fays admitted, surpassed anything in Spain. Fresh water flowed into the city through 2 aqueducts from springs on the mainland. Waste was collected by canoe and taken to fertilize the chinampas. The streets were swept clean by 1,000 workers. While European cities dumped sewage in the streets, Tenochtitlan had sanitation systems. On November 8, 1519, Court Fays and his army crossed the causeway into Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma came out to meet them. The 2 leaders exchanged gifts and formal greetings, with La Malinche translating every word. Moctezuma invited the Spanish to stay in one of his palaces. Why did Moctezuma let them in? Historians have debated this for 5 centuries. Some say he believed Court Fays was the god Quetzalcoatl returning as prophesied, But this explanation comes mostly from sources written after the conquest by people who wanted to justify what happened. It makes Moctezuma look foolish, which served Spanish propaganda. A more plausible explanation is that Moctezuma was playing for time. He had the Spanish exactly where he wanted them, trapped on an island surrounded by hundreds of thousands of his people, dependent on him for food and water. He could observe them, learn their weaknesses, and destroy them whenever he chose. Or so he thought. Moctezuma may also have been avoiding a direct confrontation that could destabilize his empire. The Aztec system depended on the perception of Aztec invincibility. If he attacked the Spanish and lost, even partially, that perception would shatter. Subject peoples might revolt. Better to wait, negotiate, find a peaceful solution. If possible, for a few weeks, the arrangement seemed to work. The Spanish marveled at the city. They visited the markets and the temples. They were horrified by the evidence of human sacrifice, but impressed by everything else. Cortes wrote to the Spanish king that the craftsmanship surpassed anything in Spain. Then, about a week after arriving, Cortes made his move. Using a pretext involving the death of some Spanish soldiers on the coast, he demanded that Moctezuma come to the Spanish quarters as a hostage. After hours of negotiation and threats, with La Malinche translating every word, Moctezuma agreed. From that moment, Moctezuma ruled in name only. Cortes controlled access to him. Cortes dictated what orders he could give. The most powerful ruler in the Americas had become a puppet, and yet the Aztec system continued functioning, at least on the surface, because no one knew quite what to do. The Aztec political system did not have a clear mechanism for this situation. Moctezuma was still alive, still officially emperor. Attacking the Spanish would mean attacking him, but he was clearly not free. The nobles debated and waited, paralyzed by a situation that had no precedent. For months, this strange arrangement continued. The Spanish collected gold and demanded tribute. They destroyed religious idols and erected crosses. They did everything conquerors do. But they did it through Moctezuma, maintaining the fiction that he was still in charge. The gold that flowed into Spanish hands was staggering. They melted down priceless artworks into ingots for easier transport. Jewelry that had taken generations to create became mere metal. The artistic heritage of an entire civilization reduced to pounds and ounces. In spring of 1520, the situation became more complicated. A new Spanish expedition arrived on the coast, but these were not reinforcements for Cortes. They had been sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest him for exceeding his orders. Cortes left Tenochtitlan with most of his men to deal with this threat. He left behind a small garrison under Pedro de Alvarado, a man known for his red hair and his cruelty. Cortes took Moctezuma's gold and Cortes's own ambition. He left behind 80 Spanish soldiers, a few hundred Tlaxcalan warriors, and a volatile situation that was about to explode. In May 1520, the Aztecs prepared to celebrate one of their most important religious festivals. Thousands of nobles and warriors gathered in the great temple precinct, unarmed as required by sacred tradition. They danced and sang to honor their gods. They did not know they were about to die. Alvarado claimed later that he had discovered a plot against the Spanish. He said the festival was cover for an attack. But the evidence suggests something simpler and darker. He saw a temple precinct full of unarmed aristocrats wearing gold ornaments. He saw an opportunity. The Spanish attacked the unarmed crowd. They blocked the exits and killed everyone they could reach. Estimates range from hundreds to thousands dead. The best warriors, the highest nobles, the priests and leaders of Aztec society slaughtered while celebrating their gods. This was not warfare, this was mass murder. The Aztecs rose up. They had tolerated the Spanish presence because Moctezuma was still alive, still nominally in charge. But after the massacre, that calculus changed. They besieged the Spanish quarters. They cut off food and water. They attacked anyone who tried to leave. Court Fay's returned to find his garrison under siege and the city in open revolt. He had defeated the expeditions sent to arrest him and absorbed most of its soldiers. He now had over 1,000 Spaniards, but they were trapped on an island surrounded by hundreds of thousands of furious Aztecs. Court Fay's forced Moctezuma to address his people from a rooftop, hoping to calm the rebellion. The crowd responded with stones and arrows. According to Spanish accounts, Moctezuma was struck and died of his wounds 3 days later. Aztec accounts say the Spanish killed him when they realized he was no longer useful. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spanish tried to escape. They loaded themselves with as much gold as they could carry and crept across the causeway under cover of darkness. The Aztecs discovered them. What followed was a massacre in reverse. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers drowned, weighed down by the gold they refused to abandon. Thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies were killed. Court Fay's himself was wounded. The survivors fled to Tlaxcala, broken and humiliated. The Spanish called it La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Aztecs pursued them for days. Stragglers were captured and sacrificed on the temple pyramids. The Spanish who escaped were exhausted, wounded, and demoralized. They had lost most of their gold, most of their weapons, and most of their men. The conquest seemed over. Legend says Court Fay sat beneath a tree and wept for his fallen men. Whether that is true or not, the defeat was complete. A year earlier, he had marched confidently into the greatest city in the Americas. Now he was a fugitive, running for his life with the tattered remnants of his army. But the Tlaxcalans did not abandon them. This is the crucial detail that saved the conquest. The Aztecs had been Tlaxcala's enemy for generations. The Tlaxcalans saw the Spanish not as foreigners who had been defeated, but as allies who could still help them destroy Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan celebrated. The strangers had been driven out. The gods had been avenged. The empire would continue. Moctezuma was dead, but his brother Quitlafehuac had taken the throne. He would lead the Aztecs to final victory. Or so everyone believed, but something else had entered Tenochtitlan with the Spanish. Something invisible, something deadlier than any weapon. One of the soldiers in the expedition had been infected with smallpox. The disease had already begun spreading through the city. The people of the Americas had never been exposed to smallpox. They had no immunity whatsoever. When the virus reached Tenochtitlan, it spread with terrifying speed. Within weeks, the city was dying. The new emperor, Quitlafehuac, ruled for only 80 days before the disease killed him too. The symptoms were horrifying. Fever came first, then the distinctive pustules covering the entire body. The sick could not care for each other. The dead could not be buried fast enough. Entire families died in their homes, with no one left to mourn them. The epidemic killed warriors who could have defended the city. It killed farmers who could have grown food. It killed priests who might have rallied the people. It killed potters and weavers and merchants and children. It killed indiscriminately and completely. Estimates suggest that smallpox killed between 40 and 50% of the population of central Mexico in the following months. In some communities, the death rate was even higher. Entire families died together. There was no one left to bury the dead, no one left to harvest crops, no one left to defend the city. And smallpox did not stop at Tenochtitlan. It spread along trade routes, reaching communities that had never seen a European. The disease traveled faster than any messenger. By the time many people heard about the strangers from across the sea, the strangers' diseases had already arrived. While Tenochtitlan died from disease, Cortes rebuilt his army. The Tlaxcalans remained loyal, seeing the epidemic as divine punishment for the Aztecs. More indigenous groups joined the coalition. Spanish reinforcements arrived from Cuba and the Caribbean. By spring of 1521, Cortes had assembled the largest force of the entire conquest. Cortes had 13 small ships called brigantines built and carried in pieces across the mountains to Lake Texcoco. These would give him control of the water around Tenochtitlan, cutting off the causeways that connected the city to the mainland. The Aztecs had never faced naval warfare. In May 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. Cortes had about 900 Spanish soldiers and somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 indigenous allies. The city was defended by a population already devastated by disease, led by a teenage emperor named Cuauhtémoc. Cuauhtémoc was only about 18 years old. He had inherited an empire in collapse, an army decimated by disease, and an enemy with technological superiority and overwhelming numbers. He chose to fight anyway. The defense of Tenochtitlan would last 93 days. The Spanish and their allies surrounded the city on all sides. The brigantines controlled the lake. The causeways were blocked. No food could enter. No one could escape. The city that had been the wonder of the world was now a trap. Cortes sent repeated offers of surrender. Cuauhtémoc rejected them all. He knew what Spanish mercy meant. He had seen Cholula. He had seen the temple massacre. He had seen his people die in their hundreds of thousands from disease. Better to die fighting than to submit. The defenders made constant sorties against the besiegers. They used canoes to attack the brigantines. They dug pits in the streets to trap cavalry. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation. At one point they nearly captured Cortes himself. The fighting was brutal. The Spanish and their allies advanced along the causeways, pushing into the city street by street. The Aztecs retreated, then counterattacked. They captured Spanish soldiers alive and sacrificed them on the pyramids while their comrades watched. The Spanish responded by systematically destroying every building they captured. Every day brought more violence. The Aztecs fought with obsidian, edged clubs and javelins. The Spanish fought with steel swords and crossbows. The brigantines controlled the lake, cutting off any hope of escape or resupply, but the defenders would not surrender. Court Phase ordered his men to fill in the canals with rubble and tear down every building as they advanced. He was destroying the city he had once called the most beautiful in the world. But he saw no other way to defeat an enemy that would not yield. Court Phase cut off the city's water supply and food imports. The defenders began to starve. They ate rats and insects and leather. They drank brackish water from the lake. Disease continued to spread among the weakened population. The city that had astounded the Spanish was becoming a charnel house, and still they fought. Court Faymoc, the young emperor, refused every offer of surrender. He rallied his starving, disease, ravaged people to resist. They fought for every street, every canal, every pyramid. They fought knowing they could not win. They fought because they were Aztecs. By August, most of Tenochtitlan had been reduced to rubble. The Spanish destroyed every building to prevent the Aztecs from using them as defensive positions. The floating gardens were burned. The temples were torn down. The causeways were broken apart. On August 13, 1521, Court Faymoc was captured while trying to escape by canoe. The last independent ruler of the Aztec Empire became a Spanish prisoner. The siege was over. Tenochtitlan, the city of dreams, was a smoking ruin. Legend says Court Faymoc asked Court Phase to kill him with the dagger at his belt. He had fought as long as he could. He had nothing left. Death seemed better than captivity, but Court Phase refused. He needed the emperor alive to legitimize Spanish rule. Court Phase kept Court Faymoc alive for years, hoping to learn where the Aztecs had hidden their treasure. When diplomatic methods failed, he resorted to torture. Court Faymoc's feet were burned with hot oil. He revealed nothing. Perhaps there was nothing to reveal. In 1525, during an expedition to Honduras, Court Phase ordered Court Faymoc hanged for allegedly plotting rebellion. The last emperor of the Aztecs died far from his ruined capital, executed by the man who had destroyed everything he loved. He was probably about 24 years old. The surviving population was forced out of the ruins. The dead were too numerous to bury. The stench was so overwhelming that the Spanish could not occupy the site for months. When they finally returned, they built Mexico City on top of the rubble, using the stones of Aztec temples to construct Spanish churches. Court Phase built his own palace on the exact spot where Moctezuma's palace had stood. The symbolism was deliberate. The old order was gone. A new world had begun. The Aztec Empire, which had dominated central Mexico for nearly a century, was finished. The Spanish brought their language, their religion, and their laws. They forced the surviving population to convert to Christianity. They tore down the temples and built churches with the same stones. They renamed everything. The land that had been Aztec became New Spain. The conquered people were not exterminated. They were enslaved, converted, and incorporated into the colonial system. They built the churches and grew the crops and mined the silver that made Spain rich. Their blood mixed with Spanish blood to create a new people. The silver mines of Mexico produced more wealth than the Spanish could have imagined. The treasure that Court Phase melted down was nothing compared to what came later. Spain became the richest power in Europe on the backs of indigenous labor and American silver. So, what was the fatal mistake? People often point to Moctezuma's decision to let Court Phase enter Tenochtitlan if he had attacked the Spanish while they were still on the coast. Outnumbered and vulnerable, the conquest might never have happened. But would it have mattered? The Spanish would have sent more expeditions. Disease would still have spread. The technology gap would still have existed. Even if Moctezuma had destroyed Court Phase, he could not have destroyed everything Court Phase represented. Spain had conquered the Caribbean. They had established colonies in Panama and Cuba. They knew there was a wealthy civilization on the mainland. If Court Phase had failed, someone else would have tried, and tried again, and kept trying until they succeeded. The real killer was something no one understood. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases that had evolved in the crowded cities of Europe and Asia for thousands of years. Diseases to which Europeans had developed partial immunity, but to which the people of the Americas had none. The real fatal mistake might have happened 12,000 years earlier, when the ancestors of the indigenous Americans crossed from Asia to the Americas. They left behind the diseases that would eventually decimate their descendants. They left behind the horses that would give Europeans military advantage. They left behind the iron and steel. Those first Americans could not have known what they were leaving behind. They could not have imagined that thousands of years later, their descendants would die from diseases they had escaped. Geography shaped destiny in ways no one could predict. Perhaps there was no mistake at all. Perhaps the collision between the old world and the new was inevitable, and the outcome was determined by factors no one could control. Geography and biology and chance working over millennia to produce a moment that lasted less than 3 years. La Malinche remains controversial in Mexico to this day. Her name has become a word for traitor. The term Malinchista describes someone who betrays their own culture. Murals depict her as a villain who sold out her people. She is blamed for the conquest itself, but she was a slave who used the only tools she had to survive. She could not have known what the conquest would become. She could not have imagined the millions who would die from disease. She was one woman caught in forces far beyond her control. In recent decades, some scholars and artists have tried to rehabilitate her image. They see not a traitor, but a survivor, not a villain, but a woman with no good choices making the best of impossible circumstances. Her story is more complicated than the legends suggest. La Malinche had a son with Court Phase, one of the first children of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. Today, most Mexicans are descendants of both the conquerors and the conquered. The people who destroyed Tenochtitlan and the people who built it are the same people's ancestors. This makes the conquest uniquely painful to contemplate. Mexicans cannot simply mourn the Aztecs as a lost people because they are the Aztecs' descendants. They cannot simply celebrate the conquest because it brought devastation. They are caught between grief and inheritance. The Aztec civilization is gone, but it is not forgotten. The Nahuatl language is still spoken by nearly 2 million people. Aztec gods live on in Catholic saints and folk traditions. The Day of the Dead blends pre-conquest beliefs with Spanish Catholicism. Something survived. In 1978, Workers digging in Mexico City accidentally uncovered a massive carved stone depicting an Aztec goddess. The discovery led to excavations that revealed the foundations of the Templo Mayor, buried beneath 5 centuries of Spanish and Mexican construction. Today you can visit the site and see where the empire's heart once beat. You can look at the carved stones that witnessed sacrifices. You can walk where Moctezuma walked and imagine what it must have been like to see your world ending. If you are drifting off now, take this with you. An empire built by human hands can be destroyed by human choices. Decisions that make perfect sense in the moment can have consequences that echo for centuries. No civilization is permanent. The Aztecs believed they had to feed the sun to keep it moving. They were wrong about the mechanism, but right about the fragility. The world does keep changing. Empires do rise and fall. The only constant is that nothing is constant. Sleep well tonight. The stones of Tenochtitlan are still beneath Mexico City, waiting for someone to remember. The descendants of Moctezuma and Cortés and La Malinche are still there, living in a world their ancestors could not have imagined. Subscribe if you want to explore more stories like this. History is full of moments when everything changed. Moments when choices made by individuals altered the fate of millions. The past is not dead. It lives beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered. What was the fatal mistake that destroyed the Aztec Empire? Maybe it was letting Cortés in. Maybe it was the alliance with the Tlaxcalans. Maybe it was the massacre at the temple. Maybe it was geography and biology working together over thousands of years. The honest answer is we do not know. The people who could have told us are gone. The civilization they built is rubble beneath a modern city. All we have are fragments and questions and the stones that remember a different world. 5 centuries later, the mystery endures. An empire that controlled millions of people destroyed in less than 3 years. A city that amazed the men who destroyed it. A woman whose translations changed history. A disease that killed more than any army. Historians still debate every aspect of the conquest. They argue about Moctezuma's motivations and Cortés's strategies. They argue about the role of disease and the importance of indigenous allies. They argue about whether the outcome was inevitable or contingent on countless small decisions. We have sources from both sides. Spanish accounts like those of Bernal de Fáez del Castillo, who was there, indigenous accounts like the Florentine Codex compiled decades later by Aztec informants. Each has biases, each tells a partial truth. The full story may be lost forever. Nearly 2 million people still speak Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. They are the living connection to a world that Europeans tried to erase. Their survival is itself a kind of victory. The conquest did not destroy everything. Something endured. Modern Mexico embraces both its indigenous and Spanish heritage. The flag bears an eagle eating a serpent, the ancient Aztec symbol of Tenochtitlan. The national narrative acknowledges conquest while celebrating resistance. History is never simple for the children of both victors and victims. Good night. Tenochtitlan is gone, but something of it survives in the blood of the people who live there now, in the words they speak, in the food they eat, in the festivals they celebrate. The past is never really past. It is just waiting beneath the surface. If you are still awake, remember this. The Aztecs thought their empire would last forever. They thought their gods protected them. They thought nothing could challenge their power. They were wrong, as all empires eventually learn they are wrong. Sleep now. Dream of pyramids rising from lakes and markets filled with treasures. Dream of warriors and priests and emperors who believed they understood the universe. Dream of the moment when two worlds collided and nothing was ever the same again.